Welcome to Whispers Beyond, where horror, philosophy, and the unknown intertwine. New full-length stories. Every Friday, your requested nightmares. Every Wednesday, bite-sized horrors. Every Monday. And in the spaces between, whispers of poetry and philosophy. Glimpses into the abyss. Like, subscribe, and listen closely.
The road has no memory, no graves, no markers, no signs warning you to turn back. It doesn't need them, because Dyer Lane remembers for you. It remembers the men pulled from their homes in the dead of night, their bodies swallowed by the fields. It remembers the cop who burned alive inside his flipped patrol car, his last radio transmission garbled with something that wasn't his voice. It remembers the blood, the prayers, the chanting, and it remembers the ones who vanished completely. The ones who left behind open car doors and silent phones still ringing with nothing but static. The ones who never got to turn around. Aaron didn't believe any of that. Not when he heard it from Cameron at the diner. Not even when Phil looked uneasy for the first time in his life. Because in the end, it was just a road. A stretch of asphalt barely a mile long, out past the city where the stars burned dull and the air smelled like dry grass. A road no different from any other. Except for the way the silence crept into the cracks. Except for the stories people told. Except for what happened when you drove it at midnight and turned off your headlights. Aaron didn't believe. Not yet. But Dyer Lane had time. And soon, it would remember him too. Don't drive down Dyer Lane at midnight. The diner was half empty, the kind of place where time felt slow and the coffee always tasted burnt. The neon buzzed faintly, a sound you didn't notice until the silence crept in. Cameron stirred his milkshake with a straw, grinning like he had a secret he was dying to share. You ever been down Dyer Lane? I glanced at Phil, who didn't even look up from his coffee. His spoon tapped the rim of his mug, slow and deliberate. Jesus, he muttered. You're not starting this again. Cameron ignored him. I'm serious, man. Midnight drive. No headlights. People say it's haunted as hell. A cop car that follows you. A ghost farmer. Satanic cults. I smirked. You down to roll? Cameron leaned back. Nah. I gotta get home to feed Boot. I blinked. What? My bunny, he said like it was obvious. She gets grumpy if dinner's late. Phil let out the heaviest sigh I'd ever heard. We are not discussing ghost stories and rabbit meal schedules in the same conversation. I laughed. So let me get this straight. You won't risk your life on Dyer Lane, but you'll gladly send me in. Cameron grinned. I'd do it if I didn't have responsibilities. Phil scoffed. You mean a rabbit? Exactly. Cameron said, nodding. I leaned back, considering it. I'd heard of Dyer Lane before, mostly as a punchline in drunk stories, something kids dared each other to do. But there were real stories, too. People had died out there. The thought sent a small thrill through me. I'll do it, I said. Phil finally looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something sharp. Great, he muttered. Another dumbass vanishing act. Cameron clapped his hands together. Hell yeah. Just don't turn off your headlights. I raised an eyebrow. Why? He hesitated. Just for a second. Then the grin came back. Because that's when it sees you. Something in his voice made the air feel heavier. I exhaled, shaking off the weird feeling. The neon buzzed louder. Maybe it was just in my head. All right, I'm going. Cameron tapped his spoon against his glass, a slow, rhythmic sound. Hope Boot doesn't miss you too much. Phil muttered, I hope you all get haunted. I grabbed my keys, and I left. The road stretched ahead like an open throat. My headlights carved a narrow path through the dark, but beyond that, there was nothing. Just endless fields, dead trees, and the kind of stillness that made you feel like the only person left in the world. The deeper I drove, the quieter it got. No crickets, no wind. Even my tires rolling over the cracked pavement felt muffled. I exhaled. It's just a road. I hit record on my phone, setting it on the dashboard. Driving down Dyer Lane. Let's see if anything happens. The air inside the car felt heavy. Not hot, not cold, just thick, like the pressure before a storm. I flicked my headlights off. The darkness swallowed me whole. I forced myself to keep driving. The road was still under my tires. I could feel it. But without my headlights, I might as well have been floating in an abyss. My fingers clenched the wheel. Then something moved. A flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. Tall, thin, not quite human. I turned my head. Nothing. I swallowed hard and faced forward. The longer I drove, the more I felt it. That sensation you get when someone's watching you. Then, a flash of red and blue in my rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. A police cruiser sat behind me, headlights dark, sirens off. Just the spinning of those muted red and blue lights. I glanced at my speedometer. 32 miles per hour. There was no reason for me to be pulled over. I turned my headlights back on. The cop car was gone. I gripped the wheel, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My phone was still recording. I exhaled a shaky breath and reached for it. I needed to hear if it picked up anything, but the screen was frozen. The timer was still running, but my voice had cut out completely. For 2 full minutes, all that played was silence. Then, at the very end of the clip, a breath. Not mine. Something breathing inside my car. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it. The shadows in the fields. The cop car that wasn't there. The breath on the recording. I tried telling myself it was a trick of the mind, that I'd psyched myself out. But that silence, 2 full minutes where my voice should have been. Something had happened, and I needed to know what. By morning, I was buried in research. I started with Dyer Lane legends, the same ghost stories Cameron had rattled off at the diner. Most of them were urban myths, but a few felt different, more specific, more detailed, like something people had been trying to forget. The lynchings were real. 1930s. Unofficial reports of men dragged from their homes. Some said they were buried. In the fields, others said they were hanged from the trees lining the road. The phantom police car had a possible source, too. 1950s. A real officer had died in a high-speed chase on Dyer Lane. The official report said his car flipped and caught fire, but some claimed no body was ever recovered. The rest was worse. 1967. A cult called the Order of Amdusias held rituals on Dyer Lane. Animal sacrifices, mutilated bodies left behind. Some say they didn't just kill animals. Some say they never really left. In the most recent case, the one that made my stomach drop. 2017. A woman named Janet Mejia was found dumped in a field off Dyer Lane. Wrapped in a sheet, face down. Her killer was never caught. I stared at the articles, feeling sick. None of this was a game. Phil barely glanced up when I dropped the printouts in front of him. I thought I told you not to call me. Just look at it, I said. He skimmed the headlines, his face unreadable. I expected him to brush it off, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temples. Jesus. So now you believe me? No. He pushed the papers back. I believe this place has a history. I don't believe you saw a ghost cop. I clenched my jaw. Come with me. Phil laughed under his breath. No chance. Phil, you know something's off about that road. That doesn't mean I want to play Ghostbusters on a street where people actually got murdered. I hesitated. Then, just sit in the car. That's it. If nothing happens, you can say I told you so and we'll never talk about it again. Phil exhaled slowly, staring at me like he was weighing a decision he already hated. After a long moment, he muttered, I need coffee first. The fields looked different this time. Maybe it was the way the moonlight sat lower in the sky, or the way the trees didn't feel like trees anymore, just twisted, black shapes against the horizon. Maybe it was the way the air felt too thick, like I was breathing in something that didn't want me there. Phil sat stiffly in the passenger seat, arms crossed. He hadn't said much since we pulled onto Dyer Lane, but I could tell he was tense. I parked on the side of the road, killed the engine, and set my voice recorder on the hood of the car. 5 minutes, Phil muttered. I nodded. 5 minutes. The wind stirred the trees. It was the only sound. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, listening, but there was nothing. Just that unnatural silence pressing against my eardrums. Then Phil tensed beside me. What? I whispered. He didn't answer. He was staring out the window. I followed his gaze. A figure moved in the field. Slow. Unnatural. A man on a tractor, rolling through the crops. But something was wrong. The tractor flickered, its form glitching in and out like an old videotape struggling to hold its image. Phil whispered, You're seeing that, right? I nodded. I barely breathed. Then, the tractor vanished. Phil slammed his fist against the dashboard. Fuck this, we're leaving! He reached for the door handle, then froze. His eyes widened. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. A handprint smeared across the windshield. Dark, greasy, from the outside. We hadn't moved. No one had touched the car. Get the recorder, I said, my voice tight. Phil didn't argue. He snatched it off the hood, and I peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. Neither of us spoke until we were back on a main road under working streetlights. Only then did Phil finally let out a breath. Jesus. I didn't answer. I was too busy gripping the recorder and trying not to shake. We sat in the diner parking lot, the engine still running, the recorder resting on the dashboard. Play it, Phil muttered. I hit rewind and pressed play. At first, nothing. Just the sound of the wind against the mic. Then, whispering. Software faint, but clear. Phil went rigid. The fuck is that? I turned up the volume. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it was rhythmic. It was chanting. Phil grabbed the recorder, paused it, and turned to me, his face pale. That's Latin. I swallowed hard. What does it say? He shook his head. I don't know. But the look in his eyes told me he didn't want to know. I didn't tell Phil I was going back. I already knew what he'd say. Don't. Leave it alone. But I couldn't. Not after the tractor glitching in and out of existence. Not after the handprint that shouldn't have been there. Not after the whispers on the recorder, speaking in a language neither of us understood. I needed answers. So I waited until midnight, and I went alone. Dyer Lane was waiting for me. The road looked the same as before, silent, empty, but I felt the difference. It knew me now. I drove slowly, heart hammering. Half of me wanted something to happen. The other half wasn't sure if I'd survive it. Then, up ahead, a shape on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. He stood in the grass, shoulders hunched, arms wrapped around himself like he was freezing. Head down, face hidden. Everything in me screamed, "Don't stop." Instead, I slowed the car. The hitchhiker lifted his hand. A slow, tired wave. I swallowed hard. My hands itched against the wheel. Every legend I'd read, every missing person's report, every story that ended in vanished without a trace, it all told me to keep driving. But I didn't. I reached over, and I unlocked the door. The hitchhiker climbed in. The second he touched the door handle, my headlights cut out. The world snapped into darkness. I couldn't see my hands. I couldn't see the dashboard. I couldn't even see the hitchhiker sitting next to me. The air shifted, heavy, electric, like the pressure before a lightning strike. And then, the hitchhiker exhaled. A slow, wet breath. Right next to my ear. I fumbled for my phone. The screen wouldn't turn on. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. I reached for the ignition. My fingers brushed the key. I turned it. Nothing. The car wouldn't start. Then, just as suddenly as they had died, my headlights flickered back on. I gasped, blinking against the sudden light. But something was wrong. I wasn't on Dyer Lane anymore. The road was gone. The trees were gone. I was somewhere else. A vast, open field stretched endlessly in every direction under a sky that wasn't black, but a deep, rotting red. And the hitchhiker was gone. But I wasn't alone. The air was thick, wrong. Not humid, not cold. Just heavy, like breathing in something dense and slow. Something that resisted the shape of my lungs. I stepped out of the car. The gravel was gone. Dyer Lane had been paved in old, cracked asphalt, but beneath my feet was nothing but dry, brittle dirt. The road, the real world, was gone. Above me, the sky churned in deep shades of red. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless expanse of dull, pulsing color, like a dying sun was rotting behind the clouds. I turned in a slow circle. No signs, no landmarks, no sound. Except something creaked in the distance. I turned toward it. A barn. It stood alone in the field, its wooden frame sagging, its walls covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Symbols burned into the wood. The door was open. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. The air inside was thicker, the pressure in my ears making my head feel full, swollen. The scent of charred wood and something rotting clung to my throat. The walls, covered in markings, carved deep like someone had taken a knife to the beams. Some looked ancient, others fresh, the splinters still curling from the cuts. On the floor, bones. Some small. Animals, maybe. others. I swallowed hard. In the center of the barn stood a wooden altar, its surface blackened and cracked, as if it had been set on fire and left to smolder. And behind it, a figure. It stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, like it had been waiting for me. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, its shape too long, too thin, as if someone had tried to draw a person and gotten the proportions wrong. But the worst part, it had no face. Just smooth, pale skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should be. I couldn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't shift. But I felt it staring at me, watching me, and then it rushed me. The call came at 3:07 a.m. Phil's phone buzzed against his nightstand, rattling the half-empty glass of water beside it. He groaned, barely awake, squinting at the screen. Aaron. He hesitated. Something in his gut twisted. Phil answered. Static. Not silence. Static. Faint, distant, crackling, like an old radio struggling to hold onto a signal. He frowned. Aaron? The static shifted. Deep in the distortion, something moved. A breath. Slow. Wet. Then, a voice. Not Aaron's. Something else. Come back. Phil sat up so fast the sheets tangled around his legs. His chest felt tight. Aaron, he said again, barely a whisper now. The static hissed. Then the line went dead. Phil didn't sleep after that. By sunrise, he was gripping his steering wheel too tight, heading straight for Dyer Lane. Aaron's car was there, parked on the shoulder. Driver's side door wide open. Empty. No Aaron. No footprints. No sign he'd ever been there at all. Phil swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hands wouldn't stop sweating. He didn't check the passenger seat. Cameron drove the road alone. He didn't believe it. Not really. Aaron was probably just screwing with them, disappearing to sell the whole thing. But still, his fingers tightened on the wheel when he reached the stretch of road where Aaron had last been seen. That's when he saw it. Up ahead, a hitchhiker, standing on the side of the road. Cameron's breath hitched. He didn't slow down, didn't even turn his head as he passed. But in his peripheral vision, he saw it move. He forced himself to stare straight ahead. But then, his headlights flickered off.